All right, so today we're diving into something I'm sure you've heard before, right? It's because we do this thing with language where, like, our brains kind of play a trick on us, but in a good way, you know?
Mm.
Like, have you ever caught yourself saying ATM machine or
Mhm.
like PIN number? Adding that extra word even though it's like already in the
Yeah,
acronym? It's so weird, but we all do it.
it's true. And the funny thing is there's actually a name for this. It's called RAS syndrome,
RAS syndrome.
a redundant acronym
Yeah,
syndrome.
so it's like redundant on purpose.
Exactly. It's like the name itself is a little meta, isn't it?
That's wild. Okay, so we've got a bunch of articles and research all about this RAS syndrome thing, and we're gonna like really unpack it today. Like, why do we do this? Is it just us being bad at language, or is there something else going on?
Well, if you look back, the term RAS syndrome actually first popped up in, let me see, it was a 2001 article in New Scientist magazine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the writer noticed this thing, this tendency to add the extra word, even though it was already in the acronym. And it really resonated with the people. It seems kind of illogical, but often there's a reason.
Okay, so there's like a method to the madness. I'm listening.
Yeah, so acronyms are meant to be these shortcuts, right?
Yeah.
But they only work if everybody's on the same page.
Right.
Like take P number, for example. We all kind of know what a PN is now. But imagine explaining that to someone who's like never used an ATM before. PIN number just makes it super clear that we're talking about a number code, not like, a pin you use on a cork board or something.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's like we want to be extra clear, especially if we're not sure the other person knows what we're talking about.
Exactly. It's this balance between keeping things short
Yeah.
and making sure everyone understands.
Right, right.
And usually, in casual conversation, being clear wins out.
Yeah, for sure.
And context matters too, right? Like saying PIN number at the ATM, that feels totally normal.
Mm.
But if you're talking about the PIN for your phone, you're probably just say PIN.
Oh, 100%. It's like our brains just know how to like adapt to these situations, which is kind of wild when you think about it.
Yeah.
But before we like go too far down this rabbit hole, there's one thing I wanted to clarify. Isn't there like a difference between acronyms and initialisms?
You're right, there is. An acronym, like NASA, is pronounced as one word.
Right, right.
An initialism, like FBI, you say each letter.
Okay, okay, got it, got it. So, like, this whole RAS syndrome thing really shows how flexible language is. It's not just about following all the rules. It's about making sure we actually understand each other.
Yeah. It's not set in stone. It changes and grows all the time, depending on what we need. And sometimes that means using a little redundancy to make things crystal clear.
Totally, totally. Okay, so I'm looking at this list of examples from one of our sources, and it's kind of crazy how many different ways RAS syndrome shows up. For example, we've got IBAN number, ISBN number, definitely seeing a trend with numbers here.
Oh, and don't forget VIN number for cars.
Oh, right. Good one. Maybe it's because numbers are already like kind of abstract, so adding number just makes them feel more real, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like our brains are looking for something concrete to latch onto.
Yeah.
But it's not just numbers, though. There's also LCD display, PDF format.
And my personal favorite, DC Comics,
What?
Detective Comics, comics. It's like the language is telling a joke.
It does have a certain ring to it.
I know, right?
And this isn't just an English thing either. Like in French, they say le protocole IP, which is basically the internet protocol.
Yo, way.
It's a global phenomenon.
So it's like a secret language nerd handshake.
Exactly. We all get it. We're in on the joke.
That's amazing. I love it. It's like a little club we've got going on, but for language nerds.
Totally. And it's like this whole deep dive into RAS syndrome has really gotten me thinking about like how we use language every day to really like get our point across, It's this balance between keeping things short and sweet, but also making sure everyone's following along.
So what you're saying is like redundancy isn't always a bad thing. That sometimes repeating yourself a bit can actually be helpful.
Yeah, exactly. When you think about it, new acronyms are often like introduced with their full forms at first to avoid any confusion.
Right.
Then as people become more familiar with the acronym, and they might drop the extra word.
Oh, that makes sense. It's like we're not getting worse at language or anything. It's just that language is constantly evolving and keeping up with itself.
Yeah, exactly.
But then it kind of makes you wonder, like, is there ever a point where redundancy just goes too far? Where it stops being helpful and just becomes kind of clunky and awkward.
Oh, for sure. There's definitely a line there, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a difference between useful repetition and just adding unnecessary words.
It's like walking this fine line, this linguistic tightrope.
I love that. A linguistic tightrope. That's perfect.
Right. Okay, so how can we tell when we've, like, stepped off the tightrope and into, like, clunky language territory?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think a good rule of thumb is to always ask yourself, like, okay, is this actually making things clearer, or am I just like throwing in extra words for no reason?
Right.
Like, think about PIN number again. In like a technical manual for beginners, it might be helpful to spell it out,
Mm-hmm.
but in everyday conversation, it might sound a little, I don't know, off.
Yeah, it's about knowing your audience, right? Like reading the room, but for language.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about understanding those subtle, cues and using language in a way that's both like clear and engaging.
So it's more like an art than a science, then. This whole mastering RAS syndrome thing.
Definitely. It highlights how dynamic language really is.
Absolutely. Okay, so for those of us listening who aren't like linguists or language experts, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
Hmm. Well, I'd say the main thing is, like, remember that language is a tool, right? And just like any tool, it's all about using it the right way. We should aim for clarity and try to be concise, but also be mindful of who we're talking to and what we're talking about.
Right, right. It's all about context, like you said.
Exactly.
And hey, maybe have a little fun with it along the way. I mean, language doesn't always have to be so serious, right?
Totally. Embracing those little quirks and like the unexpected parts of language, that's part of what makes it fun. It's like finding these hidden gems, these little Easter eggs in a sentence.
I love that. And speaking of those quirks, I'm curious, have you ever caught yourself using RAS syndrome without even realizing it?
Oh, absolutely. I think we all have at some point.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just a natural part of how we use language. It shows how adaptable and fluid it really is.
It's like a linguistic fingerprint, almost. We all have these little quirks and habits that make the way we communicate unique.
100%.
Mm.
And those individual nuances, that's what makes studying language so fascinating. It tells us so much about who we are, not just as individuals, but as a society too.
That's so true. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive for me. I feel like I've learned so much about not just how language works, but how to use it better in my own life.
I'm glad to hear that. And this whole conversation about like redundancy and clarity, it's got me thinking.
Oh, I know that look. What's going on in that brain of yours? You've got some thoughts brewing, I can tell.
Well, it makes you wonder if a little redundancy can be useful in language, like we've been talking about, at what point is it too much? Like, is there a tipping point where it goes from making things clearer to just being confusing?
That's such a good question, and I bet there's no easy answer. It probably depends on the acronym, right? And who
Yeah.
you're talking to and situation. There's so much to consider.
Exactly. It's like this puzzle, and it makes you realize how complex and interesting language really is. Always changing and new things to figure out.
It's like language is a deep dive in itself.
Totally.
Well, on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about
I
today.
have.
So to everyone listening, pay attention to the language around you. Those little redundant acronyms are everywhere. And next time you use one, think about why.
Yeah.
You might surprise yourself with what you discover about how you use language every day.
It's fascinating.
It really is. And that's a wrap on today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.